"I'm already dead," Abigail whispered when she first opened her eyes in Nathaniel Crawford's guest room. Her words so soft and haunting that he wondered if he'd imagined them in the dim lamplight of that frozen Montana evening in 1892. When the rancher would eventually pull back the curtain 3 days later and discover the horrifying truth she'd been hiding beneath carefully arranged shadows, he would gasp and step back in shock, not from revulsion, but from understanding that he'd rescued someone who was supposed to have died in flames. Someone whose very existence put both his life and his young daughters in mortal danger from powerful men who'd already tried to kill her once and wouldn't hesitate to finish what they'd started. The woman he'd found unconscious beside an overturned carriage on the snow-covered road to his ranch wasn't just injured and traumatized. She was a ghost who'd escaped her own murder, and now the killers who'd failed the first time were hunting for proof that their carefully planned crime hadn't succeeded as completely as the Chicago newspapers had reported. Nathaniel had been returning from his monthly supply run to Helena when he'd spotted the wreckage scattered across the frozen ground like broken toys abandoned by a careless child. The expensive carriage lay on its side in a drift of snow, one wheel still spinning slowly in the bitter wind while the 2 horses that had pulled it stood nearby, their breath forming white clouds in the sub-zero air. At first glance, Nathaniel had assumed he was looking at another victim of Montana's treacherous winter roads, where a moment's inattention or a patch of hidden ice could send even the most experienced travelers into disaster that claimed lives with brutal efficiency. The woman he'd found half-buried beneath the carriage's torn leather seats had been unconscious but breathing, her expensive traveling dress torn and bloodstained, but her injuries appearing survivable if she received proper care quickly. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that had escaped its pins during the accident and skin that suggested she'd lived a life of privilege far removed from the harsh realities of frontier existence. Everything about her appearance marked her as Eastern money, the kind of wealthy traveler who occasionally passed through Montana territory on business or pleasure trips that took them far from civilization's safety. Nathaniel had wrapped the unconscious woman in his heavy coat and loaded her into his wagon with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd dealt with medical emergencies before, his movements quick but careful as he considered the 30-minute ride back to his ranch through snow that was already beginning to fall harder. His daughter Lucy would be waiting for him at home, probably worried about his delayed return, but she was mature for her 8 years and perfectly capable of managing their household routines until he arrived with their unexpected guest. The Crawford Ranch sat in a protected valley 20 miles from Helena, a thriving cattle operation that Nathaniel had built through 15 years of backbreaking work and careful management. The main house was comfortable but not luxurious, designed for practicality rather than elegance, with a guest room that had been prepared for emergencies exactly like this one. Nathaniel's late wife Caroline had been the community's unofficial nurse before her death from pneumonia 5 years earlier, and their home had served as a refuge for travelers and neighbors who needed medical attention when the nearest doctor was days away. For 3 days, the mysterious woman had drifted in and out of fevered consciousness, mumbling words that made no sense and thrashing restlessly in her sleep as if fighting invisible attackers. Nathaniel had tended her injuries with the basic medical knowledge Caroline had taught him, cleaning her wounds and monitoring her fever, while Lucy helped by bringing fresh water and keeping the room's fire burning. The woman's physical injuries were healing properly, but her mental state remained troubling, marked by nightmares that made her cry out in terror and periods of wakefulness when she stared at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to see horrors no one else could witness. "I'm already dead," she'd whispered that first night when consciousness briefly returned, her green eyes focusing on Nathaniel's face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "They think I burned. They think there's nothing left." The words had been spoken with such conviction that Nathaniel wondered if head trauma from the accident had damaged her memory or ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. But there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't confused about her circumstances. She was trying to warn him about dangers he didn't yet understand. When morning came and brought full daylight streaming through the guest room's windows, the woman had retreated deeper under her blankets, refusing to let any illumination touch her face while insisting that all curtains remain drawn at all times. Her behavior was growing stranger rather than improving as her physical condition stabilized. leaving Nathaniel with more questions than answers about the identity and circumstances of the person he'd rescued from that frozen Montana road. Nathaniel Crawford found himself walking on eggshells around his mysterious guest as days passed, and her behavior grew increasingly erratic. Her refusal to explain her identity or circumstances creating an atmosphere of tension that even his 8-year-old daughter Lucy had begun to notice. The woman who called herself Abigail would only emerge from the guest room after dark, moving through his house like a wraith in borrowed clothes that hung loose on her diminished frame, always keeping to the shadows and flinching violently at any unexpected sound. Her constant vigilance and paranoid behavior suggested someone fleeing from more than just the trauma of a carriage accident, someone who expected danger to find her even in the remote safety of his Montana ranch. "Papa, why doesn't the lady ever eat with us?" Lucy asked during breakfast on the fourth morning, her innocent question highlighting the strange isolation their guest had imposed upon herself. "And why does she cry at night? I can hear her through the walls, but when I try to talk to her, she just tells me to stay away." The child's natural compassion was being frustrated by Abigail's refusal to accept comfort or companionship, creating confusion in a household that had always welcomed travelers with open hospitality. Nathaniel had noticed the same disturbing patterns in their guest's behavior. The way she avoided mirrors and windows, her insistence on keeping curtains drawn even during daylight hours, and her habit of positioning herself near exits as if constantly planning escape routes. Most troubling were the nights when he heard her pacing the floor above his bedroom, her footsteps accompanied by whispered conversations with invisible companions and occasional outbursts of terror that suggested nightmares bleeding into waking hours. The breakthrough came when Nathaniel decided to force a confrontation about Abigail's obvious distress, concerned that her mental state was deteriorating rather than improving despite the physical healing of her injuries. He'd prepared a breakfast tray with extra care, including wildflowers that Lucy had picked and arranged in a small vase, hoping that small gestures of kindness might penetrate whatever psychological barriers their guest had erected around herself. When he knocked on the guest room door and received no response, Nathaniel entered quietly, expecting to find Abigail still sleeping as she often did during daylight hours. Instead, he discovered her standing motionless beside the window, her back turned toward him and her posture rigid with tension that suggested she'd been listening to sounds he couldn't hear. The room was dim as always, heavy curtains blocking most of the morning sunlight and creating an atmosphere more suited to a sick room than a comfortable guest accommodation. "Good morning, Abigail," Nathaniel said gently, setting the breakfast tray on the bedside table while studying her unmoving figure with growing concern. "Lucy picked these flowers for you. She's worried that you don't seem to be feeling better." His words carried the patient tone of someone trying to coax a frightened animal into accepting help, recognizing that whatever had happened to this woman had left her more damaged than any physical injury could explain. Abigail didn't respond to his greeting, her attention focused entirely on something outside the window that Nathaniel couldn't identify. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, suggesting panic or fear that was building toward a crisis point, and her hands were clenched into fists that trembled with suppressed emotion. The borrowed dress she wore hung loosely on her frame, emphasizing the weight loss that suggested she'd been barely eating despite his efforts to provide nourishing meals. Concerned that she might be experiencing some kind of medical emergency, Nathaniel moved toward the window to check what had captured her attention so completely. "What are you looking at?" he asked, reaching for the curtain cord to let in more light so he could assess her condition properly. "There's nothing out there but the pasture." His words died as Abigail turned sharply toward him, her movement so sudden and desperate that it startled him into stepping backward. The gasp that escaped Nathaniel's lips was involuntary and immediate, his breath catching in his throat as he saw for the first time what Abigail had been hiding beneath carefully arranged shadows and strategic positioning. The right side of her face was a landscape of scar tissue, burns that had healed but left permanent testimony to some horrific encounter with fire. The damage extended from her temple to her jaw, pulling at her skin in ways that distorted her features and created a grotesque contrast with the unmarked beauty of her left profile. "Now you understand," Abigail said quietly, her voice carrying the flat resignation of someone who'd grown accustomed to shock and revulsion from others. "I really did die in that fire. What you saved is just what was left behind. The way she spoke about herself in past tense revealed depths of trauma that went far beyond physical disfigurement, suggesting someone whose sense of identity had been destroyed along with half her face. Nathaniel's reaction to Abigail's disfigurement was nothing like what she'd expected from months of seeing horror and pity in the eyes of doctors and nurses who'd treated her injuries. Instead of recoiling in disgust or offering empty platitudes about her appearance, he simply moved closer, his weathered rancher's hands reaching out to gently tilt her chin toward the light so he could examine the extent of her scars with the practical assessment of someone who'd dealt with plenty of injuries on the frontier. "These are old burns," he said quietly, his voice carrying professional interest rather than revulsion. "Months old, maybe longer. Someone did this to you deliberately." The statement wasn't a question but a conclusion drawn from years of experience with accidents versus intentional violence. Abigail's eyes filled with tears at his matter-of-fact acceptance of her condition, the absence of shock or false sympathy more healing than any medicine she'd received during her long recovery. "My husband," she whispered, the words barely audible in the dim room, but carrying enough venom to make Nathaniel's jaw tighten with anger. "Cornelius Blackwood. He owns half of Chicago's grain warehouses and most of the politicians who regulate them. When my father died and left me his shipping fortune, Cornelius decided he'd rather be a widower than share control of the combined businesses." The name Blackwood meant nothing to Nathaniel, but the way Abigail spoke it suggested someone with enough power and ruthlessness to plan murder without fear of consequences. "He tried to kill you for money?" Nathaniel asked, though frontier life had already taught him that people were capable of terrible acts when sufficient wealth was at stake. The scars on Abigail's face told a story of calculated violence that went far beyond a crime of passion or momentary madness. "The fire was supposed to look like an accident," Abigail continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the burden she'd been carrying alone for months. "Our summer house in Lake Forest, a faulty oil lamp in my bedroom while I slept. Cornelius was conveniently in the city on business, with dozens of witnesses to establish his alibi. But I woke up when the flames started, managed to escape through a window before the roof collapsed." She touched the scars on her face unconsciously, reliving the terror of that night when death had come calling in the form of deliberate flames. Nathaniel felt rage building in his chest as he imagined the calculating cruelty required to burn someone alive for financial gain, the kind of evil that frontier justice dealt with swiftly and permanently. "But you survived," he said, studying her face with new understanding of the strength it must have taken to escape such a carefully planned murder. "Why doesn't he know? Why do people think you're dead?" The questions were practical rather than sympathetic, focused on understanding the danger she faced rather than dwelling on past trauma. "Because I was supposed to be unrecognizable," Abigail explained, her hand moving to the worst of her scars near her hairline. "Cornelius expected the fire to destroy any evidence that might contradict the story about an accidental death. When I escaped, I was burned badly enough that the doctors weren't sure I'd survive. I spent months in a private clinic outside Chicago, registered under a false name while my face healed. By the time I was strong enough to think clearly, I'd been declared dead and buried, and Cornelius had inherited everything." The complexity of her situation was becoming clear to Nathaniel as he processed the implications of her survival. A woman who was legally dead couldn't reclaim her identity without proof that would put her in immediate danger from someone who'd already tried to kill her once. "So you ran," he said, understanding why she'd been traveling alone through Montana territory with expensive clothes but no identification. "But why didn't you go to the law? Surely there are honest officials who would investigate if you told them what happened." Abigail's bitter laugh held no humor, only the cynicism of someone who'd learned hard lessons about the relationship between wealth and justice. "Cornelius owns judges, police captains, and newspaper editors throughout Illinois. My word against his would be worthless, especially looking like this." She gestured toward her scars with self-loathing that broke Nathaniel's heart. Who would believe that a respected businessman tried to murder his wife when there's a death certificate, insurance payments, and public mourning to prove she died accidentally? The sound of horses approaching the ranch house made Abigail freeze with terror so complete that Nathaniel could see her pulse racing in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow as panic overwhelmed rational thought. "They found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with absolute certainty that her worst fears were about to be realized. "I knew they'd track me down eventually. Cornelius has connections everywhere, people who owe him favors." Nathaniel moved to the window and carefully peered through a gap in the curtains, relieved to see only his neighbor Jim Patterson riding up the lane with what appeared to be urgent news rather than hired killers seeking a woman who was supposed to be dead. "It's just Jim Patterson from the next ranch over," he told Abigail, watching her slowly exhale as immediate danger passed. "But your reaction tells me everything I need to know about how seriously we should take the threat you're facing." "You don't understand," Abigail said desperately, grabbing Nathaniel's arm with strength that surprised him. "Cornelius has hired private detectives, bounty hunters, men who specialize in finding people who don't want to be found. They're not just looking for me. They're looking for anyone who might have helped me disappear. If they discover I was here, if they connect you to my survival, they'll kill you and your daughter without hesitation to eliminate witnesses." The threat to Lucy changed everything for Nathaniel, transforming his sympathy for Abigail's plight into cold calculation about how to protect his family while still helping someone who desperately needed sanctuary. "Then we need to be smarter than they are," he said with the grim determination that had sustained him through years of frontier challenges. "If you're officially dead, we need to make sure you stay that way until we can figure out how to turn the tables on your husband. But first, we need to hear what Jim Patterson has to say. News travels fast in this territory, and he might have information about strangers asking questions." As Nathaniel prepared to go downstairs and speak with his neighbor, Abigail caught his sleeve one more time, her scarred face showing vulnerability that made her beautiful despite the damage fire had inflicted. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "You could turn me in, collect whatever reward Cornelius is offering, and protect your daughter by getting rid of the danger I've brought to your home." The question revealed how thoroughly her husband's betrayal had destroyed her ability to trust in human decency. Nathaniel's answer was simple and direct, carrying the moral certainty that had guided his life since Caroline's death left him responsible for raising their daughter alone. "Because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing the safe thing," he said quietly. "And because no one deserves to be murdered for money, especially not by someone who promised to protect them." His words carried a promise that Abigail was no longer fighting her battle alone, that she'd found an ally willing to risk everything to ensure that justice prevailed over wealth and corruption. 6 months later, Abigail stood on the front porch of the Crawford Ranch watching Nathaniel and Lucy work together to brand the spring calves. Her scarred face turned confidently toward the Montana sunshine for the first time since that terrible night when fire had nearly claimed her life. The conversation with Jim Patterson that had terrified her so completely had actually brought the best possible news. Cornelius Blackwood was dead, killed in a carriage accident in Chicago, while fleeing federal marshals who'd finally gathered enough evidence to arrest him for multiple counts of fraud and murder. The private investigators he'd hired to find his supposedly dead wife had instead led authorities to a network of corruption that reached far beyond one man's greed, bringing down an entire criminal enterprise built on violence and intimidation. The turning point had come when Nathaniel convinced Abigail to write detailed letters to federal authorities describing Cornelius's crimes, not just the attempted murder, but years of illegal business practices that had destroyed competitors and corrupted officials throughout Illinois. Her testimony, combined with evidence from other victims who'd been afraid to speak while Cornelius lived, had created an unstoppable case that even his wealth and political connections couldn't suppress. The man who'd believed himself above the law had discovered that justice, while sometimes slow, was ultimately inescapable when enough brave people decided to stand up to evil. Dr. Morrison, the territorial physician who'd been treating Abigail's ongoing medical need, had become an unexpected ally in her recovery by connecting her with other burn survivors and teaching her techniques for managing both physical discomfort and psychological trauma. The scars would never disappear completely, but they'd faded enough that people could see past the damage to the intelligent, courageous woman underneath. More importantly, Abigail had learned to see herself as a survivor rather than a victim, someone whose ordeal had revealed inner strength she'd never known she possessed. Lucy Crawford had been instrumental in Abigail's emotional healing, the 8-year-old's natural acceptance and affection providing daily proof that physical appearance mattered far less than character and kindness. The child had never shown fear or revulsion toward Abigail's scars, instead treating her as the mother figure she'd been missing since Caroline's death 5 years earlier. Their relationship had developed organically, built on shared domestic responsibilities and quiet conversations that gradually rebuilt Abigail's faith in the possibility of normal human connections. Nathaniel's feelings for Abigail had deepened far beyond the protective instincts that had initially motivated his help, evolving into the kind of profound love that was built on mutual respect, shared values, and the intimate knowledge that comes from facing life-threatening challenges together. He'd never been bothered by her physical scars, seeing them as testimony to her courage rather than evidence of damage. But watching her regain confidence and joy had been more beautiful than any mere physical healing could have accomplished. "The circuit judge will be in Helena next week," Nathaniel said as he joined Abigail on the porch after finishing his work with the cattle, his shirt stained with honest sweat and his eyes bright with the satisfaction that came from meaningful labor. "If you're ready, we could make the trip to town and finally make our arrangement official. Lucy's been asking when she can start calling you Mama instead of Miss Abigail." His proposal was characteristically practical, but the love in his voice transformed the simple words into something deeply romantic. Abigail's answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted of Montana sunshine and prairie wind, seasoned with tears of joy rather than the bitter grief that had marked so much of her recent past. "I've been ready since the day you pulled back that curtain and saw the worst of me, but chose to stay anyway," she whispered against his lips. "You saved my life in more ways than one, Nathaniel Crawford, and I want to spend whatever years I have left showing you how grateful I am for that gift." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Helena's small church, attended by friends and neighbors who'd come to know Abigail as someone who'd survived unimaginable trauma with grace and dignity intact. Lucy served as maid of honor, glowing with pride as she watched her father marry the woman who'd brought laughter and warmth back to their home. Dr. Morrison walked Abigail down the aisle, having become a father figure during her recovery, while Jim Patterson and several other ranching families filled the pews with people who understood that frontier life required accepting others based on character rather than appearance. The ceremony was simple but profound, with vows that carried extra weight, because both bride and groom understood how precious and fragile happiness could be. When Nathaniel lifted Abigail's veil to kiss his bride, the sunlight streaming through the church windows illuminated scars that had become symbols of survival rather than sources of shame. The congregation's enthusiastic applause reflected their community's acceptance of a love story that had triumphed over violence, corruption, and despair through the simple power of decent people choosing to help each other. Years passed, and the Crawford Ranch became known throughout Montana Territory as a place where people facing impossible circumstances could find refuge and support while rebuilding their lives. Nathaniel and Abigail established a fund to help other victims of domestic violence escape dangerous situations, using her inheritance from her father's estate, finally released after Cornelius's criminal empire collapsed, to create safe havens for women and children who needed fresh starts. Their work attracted attention from reformers and legislators who were beginning to recognize that society needed better protections for people trapped in abusive relationships. Lucy grew up understanding that real beauty came from courage, compassion, and integrity rather than physical perfection, lessons that shaped her into a remarkable young woman who eventually became a physician specializing in treating burn victims and trauma survivors. The little girl who'd accepted Abigail's scars without question became an adult who dedicated her life to helping others heal from similar wounds, carrying forward the legacy of love and acceptance that had defined her childhood. Abigail never completely overcame the psychological scars left by her husband's betrayal and attempted murder, but she learned to transform her trauma into strength that helped others facing similar challenges. Her published memoir about surviving domestic violence and starting over became essential reading for social workers, legal advocates, and others working to protect vulnerable women from predatory spouses. The woman who'd once believed she was already dead had become a powerful voice for justice and healing. On quiet evenings, Nathaniel and Abigail would sit on their porch watching the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, marveling at how a chance encounter on a frozen Montana road had led to a love deeper and more meaningful than either had ever imagined possible. The rancher who'd simply been trying to help a stranger in need had found his soulmate, while the woman who'd lost everything to her husband's greed had discovered that some kinds of wealth, love, family, community, purpose could never be stolen or destroyed by those who confused power with worth. Their story became legend throughout the territory, proof that even the darkest circumstances could lead to unexpected blessings when people chose compassion over fear, justice over convenience, and love over safety. The scars that had once marked Abigail as damaged goods became symbols of resilience that inspired others to believe in the possibility of healing and renewal, no matter how impossible their situations might seem. This incredible story of survival, justice, and transformative love reminds us that sometimes our greatest tragedies become the foundation for our most meaningful triumphs. If Abigail and Nathaniel's journey from desperate circumstances to healing love moved your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because everyone needs to hear stories that show us how courage and compassion can overcome even the darkest evil. Share this powerful tale of second chances with someone who needs to remember that they are stronger than their worst moments and worthy of love regardless of their scars. Tell me in the comments which moment touched you most deeply: Abigail's courage in revealing her truth, Nathaniel's unwavering acceptance and protection, or their beautiful triumph over corruption and violence. Your engagement helps these life-changing stories reach others who desperately need hope and inspiration. What story of love conquering impossible odds should we explore next? Remember, you are never too broken to deserve love, never too damaged to start again, and never alone when you find people who see your worth beyond your wounds.